Welcome. I'm Elizabeth Donahue. I run Public and External Affairs here at the school. And today we're very happy to welcome Jeremy Ben-Ami, who is the great class of 1984. And I'm president and founder of J Street for a talk titled The Two-State Solution, What It Really Takes to Get to Yes. This event was co-sponsored by a student group, J Street U Princeton. I think some of you are here, yay. And I'm told that the last time you were here, the bowl was not filled, and we've managed to fill Dodds, and I give the students all that credit. So it's always good to have a student group helping you organize an event. And J Street gets a lot of that credit as well. So we'd like to thank Andrew Gordon-Kirsch, who's the Mid-Atlantic campus organizer for J Street U, for his efforts as well today. So here to introduce Mr. Ben-Ami is Aryeh Nussbaum-Cohen, who's the Princeton class of 2015. I don't think you get the great until you graduate. And the president of J Street U Princeton. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Dean Donahue, for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here today with all of you. It's an incredibly exciting time to be here discussing these issues as Palestinian and Israeli leaders are negotiating as we speak. And who better to give us insight into the current political moment than Jeremy Ben-Ami? But first, I'd like to take a minute today to talk about J Street and J Street U. So for those of you who aren't college students, J Street Central Jersey has a very active chapter and is working to change the conversation around these issues in our local community. And I urge you all to certainly get involved. But I'd also like to tell you a story about J Street U Princeton. It was the week before Thanksgiving last year, so almost a year ago to the day. And Operation Pillar of Defense, which was the latest Gaza-Israel flare-up, had just broken out. For the first time in my year and a third at Princeton, there was a really, really public conversation going on about Israel and the conflict, and it wasn't pretty. There were protests in front of our campus center, countering columns in the campus newspaper, and countering posters up all over campus. And I knew I cared deeply about Israel and Palestine, and that watching the conflict go on in Gaza was emotionally draining. Watching that Haaretz live feed of all the bombings and rocket firings was emotionally draining. But I just couldn't ignore what was going on. I was feeling really frustrated by the lack of real conversation on campus about issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I decided to found J Street U Princeton, which is now going strong as one of the 50-plus chapters nationwide of J Street U, the student organizing arm of J Street. And since J Street U Princeton's founding a year ago, we've grown quickly to become one of the largest chapters in our region. We brought 24 students to the J Street National Conference this last month. And we've been hosting lectures, film screenings, and our signature J Street Brew program, which provides students a forum to learn about the key issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and discuss these issues with students of all different backgrounds and perspectives. And although I was convinced that there wouldn't be students here interested in J Street U, well, I was wrong. After we had run our first free programs, I met Natasha Midorsky, who had grown up in a Reformed Jewish background, but had an Israel education growing up that entirely lacked substance. And while she was excited by J Street U's work to change the way we talk about Israel in our community. And I met AJ Sibley, who's not Jewish, and he grew up politically engaged but never felt connected to Israel-Palestine or the conflict until he heard about J Street U and realized that this was a place where he could affect real concrete change in working to end the conflict. We've hosted events that have challenged the assumptions of students of all backgrounds, and for a year now, we've been creating a conversation for creating space for a real, constructive, and critical conversation about the conflict on campus. So we're really excited to have Jeremy Ben-Ami here with us today to address questions about why this round of peace talks that's currently going on is different from previous attempts at peace, what the potential stumbling blocks are, and what Americans can do now to advance the prospects of peace. Mr. Ben-Ami has nearly 30 years of experience in government, politics, and communications here in the United States and in Israel. His political resume includes serving as President Bill Clinton's Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor in the mid-1990s and as Policy Director on Howard Dean's presidential campaign in 2004. He received a law degree from New York University and is a graduate in the great class of 1984 from the Woodrow Wilson School here at Princeton University. So without further ado, Mr. Jeremy Ben-Ami.
Thanks so much, Aryeh, and thank you to Elizabeth and to the Woodrow Wilson School for still having me back after I won't tell you any of the stories about our undergraduate time here. It is really wonderful to see such a full room, and I know that there are about 100 folks watching in Bowl 16 on video, and I thank them for coming and for being a part of this as well. It's great to see such interest in the topic of U.S.-Israel relations. I guess it doesn't hurt when the front page of the New York Times lead story day after day is highlighting what's going on these issues, and this is an extraordinarily interesting moment to be engaged. I'm especially pleased to see the J Street U Princeton group, and I met with them just before. It's wonderful to meet them and the 24 who came to the conference and to see the activism here, so I'm very, very excited to be back. Obviously, the topic that we're here to discuss today is another topic that I have a deep personal connection to. This is not just a policy exercise for me, and I'm sure for many of the people in the audience, wherever they come from and whatever their backgrounds. My personal connection to this issue is a family one. It goes back about 130 years to the very, very origins of Zionism, when my great-grandparents were among the first people to move from Russia to then Ottoman Palestine in 1882. They were founders of the Israeli city of Petah Tikva, and my grandparents, their children, were among the 60 families that helped to found Tel Aviv in 1909. My father was born in Tel Aviv. There's great debate as to whether or not he was, in fact, the first boy born in Tel Aviv, because all of the 60 families all claim that their kids were the first child born in Tel Aviv. It's become a mark of distinction. And my father grew up to be a very active participant in the fight for Israel's independence in 1948 on behalf of the right-wing freedom-fighting movement called the Irgun. And it is in my blood to be deeply connected to, passionate about, concerned for the state of Israel, concerned for all of the people of the region, concerned about the American role. And it is for all of those reasons that I and a group of like-minded individuals, also very much concerned with Israel's future and with American politics, founded J Street about 5 years ago to create a new voice in the American-Israel political and Jewish communal conversation. I realize that there are many people in this room who are active in J Street, and you know a lot about us, but I also know there's some people who don't, and so I just want to few minutes telling you a little bit about the core set of beliefs that motivates us, and then I'll transition into the question of what is happening at this particular moment. What can Secretary of State Kerry and President Obama do to try to help to get to yes in this conflict and to reach a resolution? And then I will also spend a few minutes talking about the role of the American Jewish community in helping to resolve the conflict. But let me start first with J Street. It is an organization that starts with the core founding principle that the Jewish people do have a right to a national home of their own in the land of Israel. They have a right to live in peace and security among their neighbors. They have a right to defend themselves. However, we see the failure to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to recognize the right of the Palestinian people to a national home of their own as a critical obstacle to the long-term security and survival of the state of Israel. Why? Because today, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the numbers, 12 million people live between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea in the land that Israel controls, including all of the land that was conquered in 1967. Of those 12 million, roughly half are Jewish and half are not. And within a few years, if you assume that current demographic trends hold, there will likely be more Palestinians than Jews that live in the land under Israel's control. And Israel will then face a fundamental choice among three things, of which it can only have two. One is control of all the land that it currently has control over. The second is the country's founding and fundamental commitment to democracy. And the third is the Jewish character of the state of Israel. I argue, and J Street was founded on this premise, that if Israel opts to retain control over all of the land in one state between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, it will have to choose between either its democratic nature or its Jewish character. Choose democracy and give everybody, all of the people who live there, the 12 million and growing, the right to vote, and the non-Jewish majority will run the state. Choose to remain under Jewish rule, and the minority of Jewish Israelis will have to deny non-Jews their equal rights under the law, and it will cease to be a democracy. So the only way for Israel to remain both Jewish in nature and democratic in character is to reach a two-state resolution to the conflict, giving up some of the land so that the Palestinian people can have a state of their own. If the Palestinian people do not soon have a viable, contiguous state, not only will Israel's character be at risk, it will become at risk of being permanently and deeply alienated from its neighbors and isolated from the international community. And we saw a glimpse of that coming isolation in the United Nations last year when Israel, and that was along with the United States, were on the losing end of a 138-9 decision to grant upgraded status to the Palestinians at the General Assembly of the United Nations. So the second core principle of J Street is that we promote a two-state solution because it is the only way for Israel to retain both its democratic character and its Jewish identity. In fact, we say that working for the creation of a Palestinian state is actually a quintessentially pro-Israel position, as Israel's survival depends on its creation. And we don't believe that the conflict is going to be resolved simply by asking the two parties to sit down together and work it out by themselves in direct negotiations. We believe the United States has a vital role to play as a mediator to bring the sides together and actively work to reach an agreement. I liken the situation to a bitter divorce dispute, where you don't tell the husband and the wife to go off into a room by themselves and simply work it out. You recognize that that is not a formula for success. You bring in a mediator, you bring in a third party. Often you put the sides in separate rooms, and you have somebody go back and forth, try to come up with a reasonable resolution, and then get them to agree and to bridge their gaps. We see this mediating role as the ultimate act of friendship that the United States can provide to Israel. So our third core principle is we define pro-Israel advocacy not in the way that it has always been defined, which is unquestioning support for the government of Israel, but as centered on active promotion of American leadership to reach a two-state resolution to the conflict. We recognize that at times our promotion of that goal, of the two-state solution, leads us to criticize the policies of the government of Israel. Perhaps it is settlement expansion, perhaps it is the root of the security barrier, perhaps it's the practices associated with maintaining the occupation of the territories that were won in 1967. But we believe that you can love the state of Israel and its people, as all of us at J Street do, as friends and as family, and still disagree with the policies of its government. The conversation around these issues requires nuance. It raises complex issues that can't be addressed in black and white. For instance, the security measures that Israel takes can't be simply understood without understanding the history of the terror and the violence that led to them in the first place. And similarly, the present-day political conflict can't be discussed in isolation from all the chapters in the history of the conflict that come before. So our fourth principle is a belief that the Jewish community in the United States will be stronger when we not only allow, but we encourage difficult issues related to Israel to be discussed openly and freely. And when we accept that criticism of Israeli policy is as much a part of mainstream pro-Israel support as reflexive endorsement of Israeli government policy. Finally, we believe that the Jewish community will be stronger when we apply the same values and principles to the behavior of the Jewish people in Israel that we apply to all other people around the world. Jewish Americans are understandably proud of the values on which we have been raised. We believe it is our role to help prepare the world. We believe in seeking peace and pursuing justice, to be a light unto the nations. We raise our children to believe that you shouldn't treat other people the way that you wouldn't want to be treated ourselves. But we make a real mistake when we tell those same children to check those values at the door of Zionism, to use the words of my good friend Peter Beinart. So those are the principles on which we started. In 5 years, we've grown from a basement startup in my basement, where we had a couple of staff and a laptop computer and absolutely no money, into a national force in Israel advocacy that today has a $7 million budget, 55 staff, 10 offices around the country, 180,000 supporters, over 40 local chapters, campus program at over 60 colleges and universities, and a rabbinic cabinet of nearly 800 rabbis. We have a political arm that is the largest pro-Israel political action committee in the country. We've endorsed 71 candidates for House and Senate in the most recent election, of whom 70 were elected, and we raised $1.8 million for them, which is nearly a third, or a little more than a third, of all the pro-Israel political action money that was raised in the last election. We have done all that because we believe that if there is going to be a two-state solution to this conflict, it is only going to come about with American help, and that the United States will only provide that help if politicians and policymakers know that there is the political support from the people that they work for behind it. So that brings me to the central question that would be of concern to a fine public policy school like the Woodrow Wilson School, which is, what can the United States do now to assist in the resolution of this long-running conflict? Over the last year, President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry have made the same case that J Street makes, that achieving a two-state solution is vital to Israel's future and its long-term security. Without a change in course, they warn, Israel is sliding towards a future of deepening conflict with its neighbors and growing isolation in the international community. But they've also made the critically important point that resolving this conflict is in the American national security interest. Just this past September, the president at the United Nations General Assembly called resolving this conflict one of the two highest priorities of his administration's foreign policy agenda, along with addressing the Iranian nuclear program. To some, this continued focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has come as quite a shock. In fact, if you had asked a year ago any Middle East pundit or policy expert whether Israeli-Palestinian peace would even be on the president's second-term agenda, they'd have said no way. But as with so many things, when you ask the experts and the pundits, the conventional wisdom on this issue proved to be wrong. It turned out that the president made the first international trip of his second term to Israel and the West Bank. And on it, he gave a powerful speech to the young people of Jerusalem in March. And he made the case that peace between Israelis and Palestinians is necessary, it's just, and it is possible. If you haven't seen that speech, and if you're interested in these issues, I urge you to pull it up on YouTube and to watch it. It is one of the most impressive and significant speeches by an American president on this topic. And from there, he handed the ball off to Secretary of State Kerry, who has demonstrated incredible commitment and perseverance over the last 6 months to restarting the peace process. And through many trips to the region and that personal dedication, Kerry made clear his view that resolving the conflict is not only a top strategic priority for the U.S., but central to his vision of his legacy as Secretary of State. And in July, thanks almost completely to the sheer force of his personal will, the Secretary succeeded in getting the Israelis and the Palestinians back to the negotiating table and committed to a 9-month effort to reach agreement on all the core issues of the conflict. Since then, the parties' lead negotiators have met, I think, over 15 times, at times for hours on end. Prisoners have been released by Israel. the Palestinians have refrained from further moves in international organizations to obtain recognition of statehood. But I'm sure you've all noticed that the talks are not going all that well. And as we approach the 4-month mark, I would say that they are in serious trouble. Israeli settlement announcements have continued. They have undermined Palestinian faith in Israeli seriousness about the process. Palestinians believe that the negotiations are simply giving Israel time and cover to continue expanding settlements to the point that a Palestinian state will no longer be viable. In fact, just this past week came the word that the Palestinian negotiating team had resigned and that the talks were on hold, although I understand that they're back and the talks resumed today, so this is going to be a constant back and forth. Similarly, Israelis, both in government and in the general public, don't believe that the Palestinians are sincere in their desire for peace. We see opinion polls that regularly say that over 80% of Israelis don't believe that the present talks will lead to a peace agreement, primarily due to their lack of faith and trust in the Palestinians. So as we meet here in mid-November at this 4-month mark in the 9-month process, it seems clear to me that the talks are approaching a critical juncture and that Secretary of State Kerry and his team face some very tough decisions in the weeks ahead about how are they going to steer these talks away from much anticipated failure towards less anticipated success. Kerry has done a lot, I would argue, at the outset to get this process on the right track. First of all, he established a separate track for talks between the United States and Israel regarding the security guarantees that the United States can provide to Israel in the context of a final deal. And he got the former CENTCOM commander, General John Allen, to play the lead role for the United States in those negotiations that are ongoing quietly with the Israeli Defense Forces and the security establishment. Second, he launched an economic initiative that's designed to engage the private sector in obtaining billions of dollars of commitments for investment in the new Palestinian state by the private sector once a deal is reached. And both of these carrots on Israeli security and Palestinian economics are very important pieces. All right, lesson number 1 is always turn off your phone. My apologies. So that goes to the rest of you too. These carrots are important pieces of a larger framework for peace that was not part of prior efforts. And similarly, the secretaries made an important push to engage the broader Arab world in this effort to secure their renewed commitment to and agreement to the Arab League's peace initiative that was first announced about 10 years ago that offers Israel full acceptance and integration into the Middle East Arab world in return for resolution of this conflict. It is essentially saying that if you resolve the 67 conflict with the Palestinians, we will resolve the 48 conflict between Israel and the broader Arab world. That is a very, very significant development. The Arab Peace Initiative has not been given enough attention by the Americans and by the Israelis in prior years and in prior efforts. But I would argue that while all of this is well and good, while the security and economic and international efforts are very important to ensuring the prospects that this will work, we've reached the point where the Secretary and the White House are going to have to decide whether they are willing to go further than any American leader has been willing to go so far and lay out an American and internationally backed framework for addressing the core issues of the conflict, from borders and security to settlements, Jerusalem, and refugees. The parameters for dealing with the issues at the heart of this conflict are well known. They have been laid out not only in academic and policy circles by some of the very experts that are, I don't know if Dan Kurtzer is in this room, but he's certainly in this building and has produced a couple of books recently that lay out for you what the parameters could be of a deal. But they have also been laid out in actual negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians who came very close to agreement, both at Camp David and Taba under Clinton with Barack and Arafat, but also in the Bush administration's final year under the Annapolis process in the talks between Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and President Abbas back in 2008. Just very quickly, those parameters for negotiations that need to be put expressly on the table include that the border between the two states will be based on the pre-1967 Green Line with adjustments, with swaps that take into account settlements that have been built over the Green Line and trade, in return for keeping those within Israel, trade them for land that's within pre-67 Israel. Two is the security issue and the security guarantees that are being negotiated and worked out right now and have been negotiated in prior arrangements that specifically feature the notion that the Palestinian state would be a demilitarized state. It would continue to have the security forces that currently coordinate with the IDF and are preventing terror and violence right now, but it would not include an army, a navy, and an air force and a full military. Third, agreement to evacuate settlements that are beyond the border of the ultimate state of Palestine, that are in the territory that is going to be the state of Palestine. An arrangement around Jerusalem, in which the Jewish neighborhoods of Jerusalem, both those in pre-67 and over the line, become the capital of the state of Israel, and the Arab neighborhoods, including the 28 Arab villages that were annexed into municipal Jerusalem in 1968, those would become the capital of the new state of Palestine. And then you take the 1 square kilometer in the center of the whole conflict, the Holy Basin, that includes the Temple Mount and the Western Wall and the mosques and all of the famous churches and the Mount of Olives where my parents are buried. That square kilometer, which has been the most fought over and contested and bloody land possibly on this planet over 3 millennia. And you say, you know what, after all this fighting, after all the bloodshed and the tears, no one should have sovereignty over that 1 square kilometer. In reality, maybe it's God's. The sovereignty doesn't belong to any one person, and it will administer it under some form of international commission to ensure that everyone, access for all religions, free access and worship and respect for all of the religions that worship that land. So the time has come for the United States, with the backing of the international community, to put these parameters on the table and say to the parties, yes or no, to serious talks within these parameters. Now, I recognize it is very possible that one or both of the parties may find it impossible to say yes to the Secretary of State and say yes to this proposal. But I would argue that it is better to focus discussion on why they are saying no to a reasonable set of parameters than to have an endless accounting of the recrimination over who is willing or not willing to come to the table to talk in the first place. So this is what I believe is the next important step for the United States in the diplomatic process. But this is the logical place to take a break in discussing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and turn for a moment to the elephant in the room, Iran. We're all well aware that the Israeli-Palestinian diplomatic track is overshadowed at the moment by the efforts of the international community through the P5+1, the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, and Iran to reach an agreement regarding the Iranian nuclear program. In fact, I believe that it's only a matter of days when it is likely that a first step deal will in fact be reached to freeze and begin to roll back Iran's nuclear program for the next 6 months in return for a limited set and reversible set of steps to relieve some of the economic pressure that has been placed on Iran by the international community. The Israeli government, in particular Prime Minister Netanyahu, is obviously deeply concerned by the prospects of the deal that is being negotiated. And much has been written, including on the front page of the New York Times this morning, about the unprecedented level of tension that is developing between the United States and Israel over the terms of the Iranian deal, which comes on top of the growing tensions between the United States and Israel surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. So I'd make a couple of comments about the Iran situation. First, on the merits of the deal. The end goal of placing economic pressure on Iran in the first place was to bring Iran to the table to reach a diplomatic resolution around their nuclear capabilities that ensures, as well as we can, that Iran is not developing a nuclear weapon. And the deal, broadly speaking, that's under consideration, since none of us know the exact terms, does exactly that. For those in this country who have supported sanctions in order to facilitate diplomacy, to turn around now and to say they're not satisfied calls into question for me whether they understand or were ever in fact committed in the first place to what a diplomatic compromise actually looks like, and it isn't simply one-sided capitulation. Second, I'm concerned about the broader impact of this tension for broader and long-term U.S.-Israel relations. For the Prime Minister of the State of Israel to inveigh against the deal in such stark terms and to use his bully pulpit and his allies in this country to whip up opposition to a deal that the rest of the international community believes is a solid deal is damaging not simply to the prospects for resolving this conflict with Iran peacefully, but it runs a real risk of damaging the most essential Israeli security asset, that is its long-term relationship with the United States. The Prime Minister is at risk of unraveling the broad international support that has existed for the sanctions regime, because if it is the United States Congress that undercuts a deal and gives the Iranian regime a way out by passing more sanctions, as the Prime Minister is calling for, then Russia, China, India, and the rest of the world are going to say, why are we continuing with this when we got to the goal line that we were all aiming for, which was to reach a deal? So I believe if a deal collapses, we are headed to one of two other possible outcomes. Both of them are worse than a deal. One is that Iran continues its nuclear program full speed ahead and ultimately does decide to develop a weapon, or at least has the capacity to do it relatively quickly. The second is that we find ourselves on the road to a military conflict, and neither of those two options is the preferred outcome. The deal being negotiated deserves the support of all those who are concerned about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East and internationally, and view it as a threat to the security not just of Israel, but to the entire region and of the world. So I'd like to take the last couple of minutes before opening up for questions and discussion to shift away for a second from the policy arena of both Israel, Palestine, and Iran, and to make a brief comment, not just on what Israel and the United States should be doing and what their policy options are, but what the American Jewish community can and should be doing on these difficult issues. The central role of American public opinion, and of the Jewish community's opinion in particular, in creating the atmosphere for success in the peace process was explicitly recognized by Secretary of State John Kerry in a June speech that he gave to the American Jewish Committee. He called in that speech for the creation and the bubbling up of what he termed the great constituency for peace that we need in order to support efforts to resolve the conflict. He said, quote, "Let your leaders and your neighbors alike know that you understand this will be a tough process with tough decisions, but that you are ready to back the leaders who make them." And in particular, he said, quote, "No one has a stronger voice in this than the American Jewish community," unquote. Unfortunately, the organized lobbies and the loudest voices in the American Jewish community have not always provided vocal and consistent support in recent years for diplomatic efforts to achieve a two-state solution. In fact, politics in Washington on this issue are often locked in an unproductive dynamic in which politicians look to score political points with the Jewish community and other constituencies by taking actions that they think favor Israel or punish the Palestinians, but in reality undermine the American ability to actually enhance the prospects for peace. Instead of looking for ways to promote the standing and advance the interests of moderate Palestinian politics and society, supposedly pro-Israel lobbyists and lawmakers in Washington consistently look for ways to punish them. This dynamic in Washington of blind support for Israeli government action and blind criticism of any Palestinian action, essentially a zero-sum approach to this conflict, is out of date, and it is damaging to American interests and American credibility. The same dynamic plays out in the American Jewish community itself, in the ongoing efforts to delegitimize Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, his Fatah party, and the PLO, to label them as not being partners for peace, when they are precisely the forces that made the decision long ago to accept nonviolence and to attempt to solve their conflict with Israel diplomatically. These are the leaders that we have asked for from the Palestinian side. And I believe that we will rue the day that we help push the moderate forces from the scene and pave the way either for Hamas and others even more extreme than them who believe that violence is the answer, or for other leaders who no longer advocate a two-state solution. In the weeks and months ahead, my organization, J Street, will be running an effort that we call the 2 campaign to build support for the peace process and to answer Secretary Kerry's call by trying to build the great constituency for peace. So we have a national petition that's running to explicitly support the Secretary's efforts. I would urge you to visit our campaign website called 2campaign, number 2 and the word campaign.com. You can text, so you can take out your phones right now if you'd like, and text your support. So this contradicts my earlier point about turning off your phones, doesn't it? Yeah. Text your support for this by texting the word peace to 69866. In addition to building that constituency for peace and demonstrating support for the Secretary's effort, there's one other important task for the 2 campaign that I will close with. And that is to help people understand, what does it really take to get to a 2-state deal? I think that in 2013, it's become too easy for people to say that they support the 2-state solution. I think there's very few people who will actually stand up and say they don't support a 2-state solution. We find over 80% support now in the American Jewish community and the American public for a 2-state solution. Maybe there's a few members of the Zionist Organization of America who may be here and willing to speak out on that. Perhaps there are some on the far left who don't believe in the concept of nation states and are opposed to the concept of nationalism, who may object to this as well. But it's no longer simply the peace camp that is expressing the importance of achieving 2 states. It's Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's AIPAC, it's the mainstream of Israeli politicians and American Jewish leaders. So the relevant question for us today that we have to push isn't whether or not you support 2 states, but what you mean by it. For instance, for Israelis and their supporters, it's time to be clear that if you're for 2 states, but you're unwilling to base the border of those 2 states on the pre-67 lines with swaps, then you're not really for a 2-state solution. If you're for, you can't say you're for 2 states, but Jerusalem has to remain the eternal undivided capital of the Jewish people and isn't going to be a capital for both peoples for 2 states. Similarly, for the Palestinians and for their supporters, you can't say you're for 2 states, but argue that all 5 million refugees and their descendants are going to return to their original property from 1948. You can't be for the 2-state solution and unwilling to acknowledge that significant steps are going to have to be taken to ensure Israel's security as part of a deal. To support 2 states, but be unwilling to acknowledge the sacrifices and the compromises to be necessary, means one is a 2-stater in name only. The 2 campaign, that's right, Sino, for those of you who know Republicans in name only, Rhino, it's Sino. The 2 campaign is designed to open up an informed conversation and a debate about all of these core issues in the conflict. These are conversations that we have put off for far too long. And we will educate the community and work to establish what the parameters for a resolution of this conflict really look like. So I hope that my comments this afternoon have sparked you to learn more about the urgency of the moment, the important decisions that lie ahead for Prime Minister Netanyahu and for American leaders, the important role that the United States has to play and the American Jewish community has to play in all of this. If you're interested, as I said, in being part of this effort, let us know. Please join us. Visit the 2 campaign website, and I look forward to taking your comments in the form of questions as we engage in a conversation for the remainder of the hour. Thank you very much.
And they really should be questions, okay? So I'm asking people not to get up to the microphones and make speeches. So we'll entertain some questions, but we're going to start with students. So, and then if we have some time left, of course, we welcome the community to come down and ask questions. So there's 2 mics here. Come on, students. Don't be shy. They're not shy.
What is your view on land swaps? For example, the settlement of Ma'ale Adumim near Jerusalem. It's very, very large. It is a reality on the ground. Do you feel that land swaps are necessary, or is the position of J Street that the settlers should just all unilaterally withdraw?
No, as I said, the land swaps are necessary. That is a fundamental parameter for the resolution of the conflict that the president has already laid out in a speech. It is American policy. It needs to be part of the parameters that are put in front of the parties. Exactly what goes and what stays, though, is the subject of the negotiation, because every settlement that you want to keep, you then need to trade territory. So if you want to keep 80% of the settlers within a future state of Israel, then you're going to have to trade about 6% of the land. If you want 70%, it's less land. If you want 85%, it's more. So that's where the negotiation is. But there has to be that kind of a trade-off. Should we alternate?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, so you've got the better deal. Line up on that side if you want.
I was lucky. It's no secret that J Street has encountered some tension with other organized actors within the American Jewish community. Earlier today, for instance, Alan Dershowitz published a fairly critical editorial against J Street in Haaretz.
Not just fairly critical.
Very critical.
Unfairly critical.
Unfairly. Well, therein lies the question, with how J Street both pushes back against that, but also tries to engage constructively and respond constructively to it, so as not to create a more adversarial relationship than necessary or than already exists, perhaps.
Well, look, I'd say to you, and I'd say to everybody, don't be afraid of a little argument, right? I mean, the issues here are really difficult. There's a lot of strong opinions on this topic. None of us has a monopoly on the truth. The Jewish tradition teaches us that you actually come closer to the truth through argument, and that you see the other side's points. There's a very lively debate within the state of Israel on all of these issues. Just go to the Knesset and watch for a little while and hear the argument there. So there's nothing wrong with the fact that, if Alan Dershowitz wants to line up with the Hawks and the settlers in Israel over the point of view that he's expressing, and I'm going to line up more with, Tzipi Livni and Ehud Olmert and some of the folks in the center, it's his right, and we should have it out. What are the reasons that he's saying for this is what he should be laying out, not calling names, and I don't want to call him names. I think, that he's making a set of arguments around Iran that lead one ultimately to say there shouldn't be any deal, right? I think that's the wrong outcome, as I said in my speech. And that's where the discussion and the debate and the argument should be, is on the substance, not on name calling, not on labeling, but on the substance and the merits of the question.
Firstly, thank you for coming to meet with us. My question is twofold. If negotiations do prove successful, crossing my fingers, and the Palestinian Authority is given sovereignty over the West Bank, what is to prevent Hamas from again democratically being elected and taking control as they did in Gaza in 2007? Further, as Hamas is not a party to the negotiations, how and any viable Palestinian state would include or will likely include the Gaza Strip, how will nation building begin with Hamas still in control?
So 2 separate questions. The first is, I think the political battle in Palestinian politics between more moderate forces and more extreme forces will be tipped by the outcome of this process. The argument of the moderates, the value proposition that's being offered by an Abbas and Fatah is stick with diplomacy, stick with negotiations, and you'll get your freedom and independence. Hamas says there's no way, the Israelis are never going to give up. The only thing they understand is force and violence and terror. Go our way. That's the fundamental argument, reduced to its most simplistic. If there is a deal, the Fatah argument proved correct, right? And there's no real argument that Hamas can put forward anymore. They don't have a wide base of support for a fundamentalist Islamic regime in Palestinian society. That is not a very popular cause. What is popular, and what won them the election in 2006, I think it was they ran on the platform of reform and change, right? There was tremendous corruption. There was a real, antipathy towards the leadership that had been sort of, benefiting personally, hadn't brought anything really to the people. And so Hamas won on a wave of change. But if Fatah and Abbas can deliver, they'll win. So I'd say number one is I'm less worried about the outcome politically if you've got a deal and you've got independence and you've got freedom and self-determination. Second, Gaza. It's a whole separate question. The final agreement that is negotiated between Israel and the PLO, which is the negotiating partner, will include provisions that relate to Gaza. But essentially, those provisions will be put on a shelf until such time as there's a political reconciliation in which the people of Gaza vote to accept that agreement. And in that agreement, they'll be committing to a state of Israel, they'll be committing to nonviolence, they'll be committing to abide by prior agreements. So if they vote to accept that, then they can get in on what I hope, will be a good deal. That they will see on the West Bank under peace, economic investment, economic growth, opportunity, hope, things that they just don't have right now in Gaza, and they'll want in. So that's, I think, the dynamic related to Gaza, but they will not be in as long as they don't accept Israel's right to exist, renounce terror and violence, and agree to agreements.
Thank you.
So you started off explaining the main reason why you started J Street, in that if Israel keeps on controlling the territory, they're faced with the choice eventually of a Jewish identity or, well, commitment to democracy. Isn't it in some sense more urgent than that? Isn't already the commitment to democracy essentially in that they control a lot of the territory already, well, not there anymore? And isn't that maybe part of the reason why there is that kind of international isolation, right? And so a related question being, you describe essentially the negotiating parties with an analogy of a divorce, and that the divorce needs some kind of ombudsman, some kind of neutral party to bring them together. Now, given the international isolation and the role that America plays in this conflict, is America really the right party to be playing that ombudsman role in the middle, given the sort of the one-sided commitment historically they've had throughout, and, well, essentially their credibility to both parties in that sense to bring a sort of neutral view to the table?
So two really important questions. The first is where the line is crossed, and have we crossed it already in terms of the erosion of the democratic character of the State of Israel? There's an argument that within the 67 lines, there is inequality. Minority citizens who are not Jewish do not have the same level of services. They do not have the same opportunities. They are not treated equally. But that's more of a civil rights issue within Israel, and that is a challenge to its democracy that needs to be met over time through working to strengthen Israel's democracy internally. Then there's what's happening over the Green Line, right, where you have no rights, no civil rights for the non-Jews who live there, living under a military court. For those who've seen the film Law in These Parts will understand that there are two systems of law that apply. And when you have two systems of law dependent on your race and your religion, you're treading perilously close to the edge of being able to claim that you're the sole democracy in the Middle East. So I think Israel is unfortunately taking some steps down that path that need to be. It's not me. I didn't.
I know. If someone has some of the earphones that are up here, if you could turn it off, I think that's what we're hearing.
I would argue that Israel has taken some steps that are down a road that it doesn't want to be going down, that really do endanger its democratic character. So that's one. The second question was about the role of the U.S. and whether or not the U.S. can be a credible, honest broker. Look, the question about what's the appropriate role for a mediator is both about what you would look for ideally and then what your options are, right? I'm not sure what the options are. Pretty much the only party that can step into this, and the whole rest of the world is looking to the U.S. It's not like, take the French. The French aren't rushing to the foreground offering to mediate this, right? There isn't anybody else. And it is important for the U.S. It can't be the mediator in this resolution if it's the lawyer for one of the sides, right? And the tension, Dan Kurtzer talks about this, and it's something that I think is right. The tension that emerges between the U.S. and Israel in these critical moments is actually an important part of the process. That if you don't have some level of push and pull between the U.S. and the parties, you're not going to move anybody towards the middle. And so we're going to see some tension, we're going to see some arguments, but I think it is part of the process that the U.S. has to engage in if it's going to play that role. But I don't see any better options is the bottom line.
When you said in the beginning that a Palestinian state should be contiguous, does that include Gaza?
Yes.
How would that work?
The talk that has always been is about a land bridge. It's about a 60-mile drive between the tip of the Gaza Strip and the edge of the West Bank, and there's a road there already. So what has been talked about in the past is some form of a land connection that would be part tunnel, part bridge, that would allow for commerce and transport to go back and forth. And that land that would be part of that land bridge is actually part of the swap that would happen for the settlements we were discussing.
So then would Israel still be contiguous too?
Yeah, because there would be a tunnel and a bridge, so roads. do you see what I'm saying? I mean, you're able to.
I see, yeah.
Right. You got to be creative to come up with these solutions. Now there's more on the left than the right.
You've mostly discussed the reaching towards a two-state solution, which makes sense. Towards an agreement of a two-state solution, which makes sense because we haven't gotten there yet. But provided that the negotiations work, I'm wondering what J Street's position is on kind of the day after, which will take an immense amount of work from Israel and the Palestinians to make that work on the ground. And does J Street have a platform in terms of the American Jewish community or the American community at large about what the next steps are towards making a sustainable peace?
Well, we don't have an explicit platform. I can tell you what our hope is. Our hope is that should the state of Israel and should the Palestinian people take these difficult decisions and have their leaders step forward, and then they both would have referendums that ratify this deal, that the United States, and not just the American Jewish community, but all those who care about this part of the world, will rally together in support of and to try to make it possible. It's going to involve economic investment that I was talking about earlier to make the Palestinian economy work. It's going to require compensation funds that are going to be international based as well as from Israel for the refugees to settle their claims. It's going to require compensation for settlers who are going to be relocated. So there's a huge amount of work. My hope is that everybody rallies together behind that. You know, the institutions of the American Jewish community, I hope, would at that point be supportive of a peace deal. If they aren't, then there's going to continue to be a role for an organization like J Street that is trying to make this work because it's critical for the future. But my hope is that there won't be a need for a J Street because the entirety of the community will recognize that finally we're on our way and moving in the right direction.
So one of the major criticisms of the two-state solution that I've always read about is that the Palestinian state would ultimately not be a stable state. And one of the proposed solutions to that I've read about is a three-state solution, where the West Bank would be put under Jordanian control and the Gaza Strip would be put under Egyptian control. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts on that.
It's very scary to be asked a question by the kid of your college roommate. We can talk about this later. No. I think that there's a lot of ideas out there because people are so frustrated and tired of talking about the two-state solution and how we get there and see that it hasn't worked. So people are constantly reaching for other ways to think about this. I would argue that there is no other way, right? There is no other solution. And there's no such thing as a one-state solution. There is either a division of this land into two states under an agreement, or there's ongoing conflict and chaos and violence. And those are the only two options. And it's very clear which is the right option of those two. On the specific one you've put forward, the last thing that the Jordanians want is to add the West Bank and 1.5 million Palestinian citizens to the state of Jordan. I think that the Egyptians have made pretty clear that they have absolutely no interest. In fact, when the negotiations took place between Begin and Sadat, Sadat tried to, Begin wanted to give the Gaza back, and Sadat said, no, thank you. This is not a real option. It may be interesting to discuss in a policy conference at the Woodrow Wilson School, but it's not a real option. And I think Dan Kurtzer, not to keep invoking him, but since he didn't show up, I'm going to keep on embarrassing him for his lack of being here. I go to hear him speak. He's traveling. Okay. But I think that Dan actually led a policy conference, and the students said at the very beginning, we're going to prove to you that there are other options other than the two-state solution, and they spent an entire term really trying to, and they finally came back at the end of the term and they said, we admit it. There's no other way to do this than a two-state solution. So,
I have two intimately interrelated questions. The first is, what do you think is to be done with Palestinians living inside of the Green Line, for whom there can be no real or genuine democratic inclusion if ethnic privilege remains written into the logic of the Israeli state? And my second question is, in your opinion, what actually makes the seizure and colonization of territory in the post-67 era somehow different from the seizure and colonization of territory in the post-48 era?
So inside the borders of the state of Israel, again, as I said earlier, I would argue that the non-Jewish citizens of the state have equal rights as citizens. I would argue that the way in which those rights are fulfilled is not equal. There is a great deal of work to be done by the State of Israel and the New Israel Fund and many other organizations that are working for civil and equal rights within Israel are working on it to try to ensure that everybody has equal rights regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, etc. The one issue that there is no give on is what's called the law of return, which provides the opportunity for Jews from all over the world to ultimately, if they need to, become citizens and come to the national homeland of the Jewish people. I understand that that is a religion-based preference that doesn't pass muster in polite circles who only favor full equality, but I'd argue, given history, that that is a right that is owed to the Jewish people by the world, and is something that I personally think is non-negotiable and is part of the reason for the existence of the State of Israel. I would argue that in terms of the division between 67 and 48, that the concept that the land that was a British mandate, that was under Ottoman control, needs to be divided between the two people who claim a homeland there is something that the world has ratified. In UN resolutions, it ratified it in 1947, it ratified it in 1967. The concept of two states for two peoples is internationally sanctioned and recognized. So that is dramatically different from Israeli control over land that was won in 1967, which is not recognized by the international community. Either it is viewed as illegal by 192 countries or illegitimate by the United States.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the effect, if any, of the Arab uprisings on the whole negotiations? Thank you.
It's a very good question, and I think there's a couple of impacts. One is, people who deal in these kinds of issues tend to take any fact that comes at them and turn it into a good rationale for the argument that they were going to make anyway, right? The question of upheaval and violence and chaos all around Israel is used by those who would argue against making peace as a good reason not to do anything. Why would you try right now to strike a peace deal and give up territory and reach agreement just as the entire region is exploding? This is the time to hunker down and circle the wagons and not do anything, right? So you can view it that way, or you can view it and say the entire rest of the region right now is dealing with its own business, right? It's trying to figure out its own country, its own societies, what to do with economically, how to create opportunity for this wave of young people that doesn't have opportunity right now. And this is precisely the time when those countries are not really focused on trying to wipe Israel off the map. So isn't this a good time for Israel to actually take some risks for peace and try to make itself acceptable to the majority of the countries in the region? So I fall into that camp. I look at almost every glass as at least half full, and so I see this as an opportunity and say that with all that's going on, this is actually a good time. A lot of the traditional adversaries of Israel are weakened. There's a coincidence of interest between Israel and the Sunni old guard regimes, let's say Saudi Arabia, regarding Iran. And so take advantage of some of the politics that are going on in the region if you're Israel, and find a way to establish your existence as an accepted part of the landscape and try to rearrange the picture to your benefit by taking these kinds of risks.
So Prime Minister Netanyahu famously held up a Wile E. Coyote cartoon and literally drew a red line across it at the UN. And since that time, Iran has carefully, but maybe slightly slyly, avoided crossing that line. And this negotiation will certainly prevent Iran from crossing that line. Why isn't that part of the discussion?
Well, I think that the credible threat of the use of military force is part of the pressure that was brought to bear. The tightening of the sanctions, the rhetoric coming from Netanyahu and the threat from the U.S. that all options are on the table was part of, I think, the atmosphere that has led the regime to give Rouhani the leeway to actually try to do something here. They want out from under the pressure, and they don't want to be attacked, and they don't want to be under this kind of international censure. So I do think that there's a role for the good cop, bad cop kind of thing, but we've reached now the point of the deal, right? Now we're at a different place, which is this is what we wanted, right? We want intrusive inspections. We want enrichment halted. We want Iraq construction to be halted. These are the things that we have to see if Iran is willing to do over the next 6 months. But can we take yes for an answer? That's really, I think, the question here.
Thanks for coming. I'm curious, in the Israeli-Palestinian talks, whether you think the United States should impose any kind of consequences on the parties if the talks break down, and whether you think that, perhaps the U.S. should be applying more leverage at this stage to make sure that talks continue and that neither side walks away when, the outlines of a deal are so clear.
Well, I think the available to the secretary in those talks is going to be, on the one hand, to say to the Palestinians, that if this collapses and you start going down the UN path, that U.S. aid is going to dry up, right? That's clear. The Israelis will stop transferring tax revenues. The Congress will stop giving you aid. So the PA will collapse, right? So he needs that talking point. Similarly, he says to the Israelis, look at what Europe is about to do, right? Europe is going to write you out of all of the contracts, all of the economic investment, all of your primary market in Europe for all of your technology and goods and access to capital. If you don't do this, this is what's coming. So I think he's got the tools in his toolkit to make that pressure extremely explicit. What underlies your question, most likely, is why doesn't the United States condition aid to Israel? That's what often is on the table. And I think that is like taking out the sledgehammer, when you need a scalpel. And that's the wrong metaphor, isn't it? But you get the idea. That would be opening up a political fight here that is unnecessary and unwinnable and won't advance the process. The pressure on Israel and the pressure on the Palestinians is just waiting in the wings, and it's really only the secretary's efforts that's holding it back. And so that's, I think, possibly good enough to give him what he needs in the talks.
We have 2 more questions and we'll end with those.
I see no more students, so I step forward.
I thought you were in your 35th year of your dissertation.
My question is about the land swaps. I hope that my assumption is correct, that you're leaving out the term mutually agreed upon was just simply an oversight. And I believe that's critical. Now, the other part is that David Makovsky has now been hired by the State Department, and he had put forward in his paper that he presented at the Institute 3 possible maps. And the problem is that as far as I've been able to determine, his suggestions have been rejected by the Palestinians, and the Israelis, even though asked repeatedly to provide what they think could be a map, have failed to do so. So the question that I have is that, assuming mutually agreed upon is the critical modifier of land swaps, How do you see this going forward, and do you think that David Makovsky, who's being listed now as the map guy, how his 3 suggestions will fly as possibilities?
You are undoubtedly the most informed person in this room. That was great. Yes, the mutually agreed words should have been in what I said. It's absolutely critical. You know, there's no imposing a solution here, in my opinion. The sides have got to consent and agree and ratify. So absolutely, mutually agreed is critical. It is really good news that David Makovsky will be a part of the team, in my opinion. Whenever, in the course of these kinds of talks over the last 5 years, I've been asked questions about maps and lines, I always refer to David Makovsky. You know, and I say if there's one person in the world who knows how to move the lines and has, you know, complete grasp of all of this. It's not just 3 options. I mean, it's not a static, you know, what his model does is allow you to move lines here and there to see what the impact is. How many more settlers can you keep and how much more territory do you need to swap? It's that kind of a dynamic model. So, you know, nothing that he's put forward, of course, has been accepted because he's been an academic. He hasn't been part of the equation. I'm arguing that the time has come for the United States to put these formally on the table. Not necessarily the maps right away. Initially, it's the parameters, but at some point, the U.S. is going to have to put maps on the table because the 2 sides are not going to do it themselves. And they're going to have to really force the parties to make some difficult choices that will be guided by David's maps and by his model. So everything you said is correct, but David's role in this is going to be a facilitator and a guide initially, and not to say, here are the 3 options, take them or leave them.
Some of us have seen a good deal of publicity for Ari Shavit through his book and Tom Friedman's column in the Sunday Times. He believes that Secretary of State Kerry will fail.
Will prevail.
Will not prevail.
Will not prevail.
And that everything that you propose and that many of us are working for as hard as we can will fail because it's not done in little steps. I wonder whether you have some comments on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, there's a lot of great arguments, and there's a lot of disagreement among those of us who share the same goal. You know, I know that Ari Shavit shares the exact same goal and the same concerns that motivate me and motivate my work and motivate J Street. You know, I don't think incremental and interim steps work. I know that the Secretary of State and Martin Indyk don't think that they work, that you really can only get agreement if you settle everything, that the problem with Oslo is that you took a few steps, but you never defined the end game. You know, maybe if you define the end game, for instance, the mutually agreed upon swaps, if you say that the Palestinian state is going to be 100% of the territory that was acquired in 1967 as the end game, and if you agree to do certain steps along the road to that in an 18-month period, you maybe by defining the end game, you could set up incremental steps to get there. But I think if you don't settle all the issues, you can't settle any of the issues. And so that's my opinion. It is based on what's happened so far. I know it's not Ari's opinion, but this is, you know, we're all trying to put our best thoughts forward and try to figure out the best way forward, and we'll have to see. So on that note, thank you all very much. Thank you for listening.